Chapter 91. George II. The Story of Bonnie Prince Charlie. George I died in 1727 A.D., and was succeeded by his son, George II. Like his father, he was very German, but he could speak a little English. He had a very clever wife called Queen Caroline, and she helped him to rule. He had also a very clever prime minister called Walpole. Walpole had begun to be powerful under George I, and although George II did not like him, he still remained in power. He was the first peace minister Britain ever had. Instead of urging the king and people to fight, he tried in every way he could to keep the peace. He saw that the best thing for the country was to be at peace. He saw that it was best for the people to have time to sow and reap, to build ships, to make goods, and to trade with other countries, and that they could neither have time nor money to do this if they were always fighting. So he would not fight, and Britain grew prosperous. But the people did not all think as Walpole did. A quarrel with Spain arose, and, try how he might, Walpole could not keep the peace, and war was declared. Strange to say, the people rejoiced at the news. They decorated their houses, lit bonfires, and rang bells as if some great good fortune had befallen the country. "They may ring their bells now," said Walpole sadly, "but they will soon be wringing their hands." The peace which had lasted 20 years was broken, and Walpole was quite right when he said that the people would soon be wringing their hands, for the war with Spain was a miserable failure, and brought much trouble and sorrow upon them. This war was followed by another called the War of the Austrian Succession. The Emperor of Austria died, leaving his kingdom to his daughter, Maria Theresa. But some of the kings of Europe thought that they would take her lands from her and make their own kingdoms greater. To prevent this, the British fought for Maria Theresa against France and Spain, and George II and his soldiers defeated the French in a battle called Dettingen. This is the last battle in which a British king led his soldiers himself. People began to see that kings could serve their countries in better ways than by fighting. While this war was going on, the Jacobites tried again to set James Stuart upon the throne. This time it was not James but his son Charles who landed in Scotland. He came with only 7 followers, and at first the people were afraid and unwilling to follow him. But Charles was very different from his father. He was gallant and brave and handsome. He talked and smiled and won his way to the brave Highland hearts, till he was at the head of 1,500 men, all willing and ready to die for their king and prince. "Go home," said one old chieftain to him when he first landed. "There is no safety for you here." "I have come home," replied Prince Charlie. "Charles Stuart," he said to another chief called Cameron of Lochiel, "has come to claim his own and win the crown of his ancestors, or die in the attempt. Lochiel, if he chooses, may stay at home and learn the fate of his prince from the newspapers." "No," replied Lochiel, "no, I will share the fate of my prince, and so shall every man over whom I have power." So in a dark Highland glen the standard of the prince was raised. It was red silk, and on it were the proud words, "Tandem triumphans," which means, "triumphant at last." And as the red silk folds fluttered out on the mountain breeze, it was greeted by the sounds of bagpipes and the shouts of the people. "Then raise the banner, raise it high, for Charles we'll conquer or we'll die. The clans alleal and true men be, and show me who will daunten thee. Our good King James will soon come hame, and traitors a' be put to shame. Auld Scotland shall again be free, there's none on earth can daunten thee." After the raising of his standard, Charles marched south till he reached Edinburgh, his army growing as he went. Lochiel and his followers marched into Edinburgh, and there, at the market cross, amid the cheering of some of the people and the sullen silence of others, James VIII was once more proclaimed King of Scotland. A beautiful lady on horseback, with a drawn sword in her hand, gave the white cockade to those who crushed round her, impatient to enter the service of the prince. Later in the day Charles himself rode into the town, and the people crowded to meet him, cheering and weeping, eager to kiss his hand or touch his clothes, covering even his boots with tears and kisses. The castle of Edinburgh was held by the soldiers of King George, and as the prince reached Holyrood, the old palace of the Stuarts, a cannon from the castle thundered out, and a shot struck the wall of the palace not far from where Charles stood. But he was neither startled nor afraid, and, turning, walked quietly into the palace. That night the prince gave a ball. The old palace, which had stood so long empty and silent, was gay with lights and flowers. The sounds of laughter and music were heard there, perhaps for the first time since the days of the beautiful Mary, Queen of Scots. Lovely ladies and brave men crowded to see and do honour to their bonny Prince Charlie, and they went away happy if they had touched his hand or heard his voice. But there were other things to do besides dancing. The army of King George, under Sir John Cope, had landed at Dunbar and was marching to Edinburgh. Charles decided to march out to meet him. Early on the morning of the 20th of September, the Highlanders rose and made ready for battle. Prince Charlie placed himself at their head and, drawing his sword, cried, "Gentlemen, I have thrown away the scabbard." By that he meant that there was no turning back, and that his sword would never again be sheathed until he conquered or died, and the men, hearing the words, shouted and cheered as they followed him. Next day a battle was fought at Prestonpans, near Edinburgh. Prince Charlie and his men were up so early that they were ready to attack before Sir John Cope and his soldiers were prepared. The Highlanders gave them no time to prepare, but charged so fiercely and quickly that in about 5 minutes the battle was over. The soldiers of King George ran away, and Charles won a complete victory. Sir John ran away too, and was the first to bring the news of his own defeat to Berwick. Cope sent a challenge fra Dunbar. "Charlie, meet me on Yadar, and I'll learn ye the art of war, if ye'll meet me in the morning." "Hey, Johnny Cope, are ye waking yet? And are your drums a-beating yet? Oh, haste ye up, for the drums do beat. Oh, fie, Cope, rise up in the morning." When Charlie looked the letter upon, he drew his sword the scabbard from. "Come follow me, my merry, merry men, and we'll meet Johnny Cope in the morning." When Johnny Cope to Berwick came, they speered at him, "Where's a' your men?" "I' faith," he say, "I dinna ken. I left them a' this morning." "Now, Johnny, troth ye were nae bleat to come wi' the news o' your ain defeat, and leave your men in sic a strait so early in the morning." A few hours after the battle, the Highlanders were back in Edinburgh, marching up and down the streets, playing "The King shall enjoy his own again" on the bagpipes. All the Jacobites rejoiced, and thought that they had really triumphed at last. End of Chapter 91. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. On September 9th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 92. George II, the story of Flora MacDonald. To your arms, Charlie yet shall be your king. To your arms, all ye lads that are loyal and true. To your arms, his valour nane can ding. And he's on the south wi' a jovial crew. For Master Johnny Cope, being destitute of hope, took horse for his life and left his men. In their arms he put no trust, for he knew it was just that the king should enjoy his own again. To your arms, my bonny Highland lads. We winna brook the rule o' a German thing. To your arms, wi' your bonnets and your plaids, and hey for Charlie and our ain true king. After the Battle of Prestonpans, Charles returned to Edinburgh and remained there for some days, gathering men and money. It was a gay time. There were constant balls and parties, and bonny Prince Charlie was loved more and more each day. The bonny prince, who could eat a dry crust, sleep on pease straw, take his dinner in 4 minutes and win a battle in 5, was toasted everywhere. At last Charles and his army were ready and marched into England. But although no one resisted him, although he took several towns without a blow being struck, hardly any of the English joined him. The Highlanders grew weary of marching through strange country, and homesick for their mountains, and many of them deserted and went home. By the time Charles reached Derby, the leaders were so disheartened that they persuaded him to turn back to Scotland. Yet the people in London were awaiting his coming in terror, and King George was ready to run away. It is difficult to guess what might have happened had the prince gone on, but he did not. He turned again towards Scotland and began the long, sad march homeward. The wearied army reached Glasgow at last, having marched 600 miles through snow and rain and wintry weather in less than 2 months. Charles now decided to take Stirling Castle. He met the king's army at Falkirk and defeated them. But after that, instead of trying to take Stirling, as he had intended, he listened to the advice of some of the Highland chiefs and marched northward. As Charles had defeated 2 generals, King George now sent his own son, the Duke of Cumberland, to command his army. At Culloden, near Inverness, the last Jacobite battle was fought. The royal army was much larger than the Jacobite one, and although the Highlanders fought with all their usual fierce courage, they were utterly defeated. Charles would have been glad to die with his brave followers, but 2 of his officers seized the bridle of his horse and forced him against his will to leave the field. The battle was turned into a terrible slaughter, for the Duke of Cumberland behaved so cruelly to the beaten rebels that ever after he was called the Butcher. The Stuart cause was lost, and bonny Prince Charlie was a hunted man. The king offered £30,000 to anyone who would take him prisoner, but although the money would have made many a poor Highlander richer than he had ever imagined it possible for anyone to be, not one of them tried to earn it. Instead, they hid their prince, fed him, clothed him, and worked for him. At last, after months of hardships and adventures, he escaped to France. Many people helped Prince Charles, but it was a beautiful lady called Flora MacDonald who perhaps helped him most. She served him when he was most miserable and in greatest danger. The whole country round was filled with soldiers searching for him. He scarcely dared to leave his hiding place, and was almost dying of hunger. No house was safe for him, and he had to hide among the rocks of the seashore, shivering with cold and drenched with rain. With great difficulty and danger to herself, Flora MacDonald reached the place where the prince was hiding, bringing with her a dress for him to wear. The prince put it on, and together they went to the house of a friend, where Flora asked if she and her maid Betty might stay that night. This friend was very fond of Flora, and very glad to see her. She was a Jacobite, and when she was told who Betty was, she made ready her best room for the prince. A little girl belonging to the house came into the hall while Betty was standing there, and ran away frightened at the great tall woman, but no one suspected who she was. Disguised as Flora MacDonald's maid, Prince Charlie travelled for many days, escaping dangers in a wonderful way. For the prince made a very funny-looking woman. He took great strides, and managed his skirt so badly that in spite of the danger, his friends could not help laughing. "They do call your highness a pretender," said one. "All I can say is that you are the worst of your trade the world has ever seen." When there was no need for Flora to go further with the prince, they took a sad farewell of each other. "I hope, madam," said he, bending over her hand and kissing it, "we shall yet meet at St. James's." By that he meant that he still hoped to be king some day, and welcome her in his palace of St. James's in London. Then he stepped into the boat, which was waiting for him, and Flora sat sadly by the shore, watching it as it sailed farther and farther away. Far over yon hills are the heathers a green, and down by the corrie that sings to the sea, that bonny young Flora sat sighing her lane, the dew on her plaid and the tear in her eye. She looked at a boat which the breezes had swung, away on the wave like a bird on the men. And aye as it listened she sighed and she sang, "Farewell to the lad I shall ne'er see again, farewell to my hero the gallant and young, farewell to the lad I shall ne'er see again." The target is torn from the arm of the just, the helmet is cleft on the brow of the brave, the claymore forever in darkness must rust, but red is the sword of the stranger and slave. The hoof of the horse and the foot of the proud have trod o'er the plumes in the bonnet of blue, why slept the red bolt in the heart of the cloud, when tyranny revelled in blood of the true. Farewell, my young hero, the gallant and good, the crown of thy fathers is torn from thy brow. This rebellion is called the 45 because it took place in 1745 AD. Prince Charlie reached France safely, but the rest of his life was sad. He was a broken, ruined man, and he lived a wanderer in many lands. At last he died in Rome on 30th of January 1788 AD, the anniversary of the day on which Charles I had been beheaded. In St. Peter's at Rome there is a monument placed there, it is said by King George IV, upon which are the names in Latin of James III, Charles III, and Henry IX, kings of England. They were kings who never ruled, and are known in history as the Old Pretender, the Younger Pretender, and Henry Cardinal of York, brother of the Young Pretender. End of chapter 92.
Chapter 93. George II, the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta. Besides the Civil War, Britain had other wars to fight. France, England's old enemy, was still the enemy of Britain. Once again there was war between them, and this time the fighting was not in France, nor in England, nor on the seas, but in far-off lands. Long ago, in the days of Elizabeth, you remember that Englishmen sailed over the seas to the newly discovered country of America, and made their home there. You remember how Raleigh claimed Virginia for England, and how later the stern Puritans sailed away in the Mayflower, and founded a new Plymouth and a New England over the sea. Little by little these colonies, as such new countries which are peopled by an old country are called, grew. Towns sprang up, harbors were built, and the colonies became a rich and powerful part of Great Britain. In another country, called India, Britain had also possessions, and trade with India had become of great importance, and was carried on chiefly by a company called the East India Company. But France, too, had colonies in India and in America, and the French and the British became so jealous of each other that war broke out in both countries. The French were much stronger in India at this time than the British, and they made up their minds to drive the British away altogether. They might have succeeded, too, but for the cleverness of a young man called Robert Clive. He was a clerk in the East India Company's office, and not a particularly good clerk either, because the work he had to do was not at all the kind of work for which he was fitted. When war broke out, Robert Clive gave up being a clerk and became a soldier, and he soon showed that he was a clever one. Some of the native Indians fought for the French and some for the British, but Clive and his sepoys, as the native soldiers were called, won, and the French governor was obliged to leave the country. A few years later, one of the native princes who had fought for the French attacked the British who were living in Calcutta. He killed many of them, destroyed their houses and factories, and those who were left alive he shut up in a horrible prison called the Black Hole. There were 146 prisoners, and the Black Hole was so small that there was hardly room in it for them to stand. The windows were so tiny that hardly any air could come through them. When the prisoners were told that they were all to go into this dreadful place, they could not believe it. They thought at first that the prince meant it as a jest. But they soon found out that it was no jest, but horrible, sinful earnest. In spite of their cries and entreaties, they were all driven in, and the door fastened. It was a hot summer night. What little air came through the tiny windows was soon poisoned by being breathed over and over again. People fainted, went mad, died. The cruel Indians held torches to the windows, and, looking in, laughed at the terrible sufferings of the poor prisoners, who cried for mercy as they beat upon the door, trying vainly in their agony to break it down. In the morning only 23 came out from the dreadful hole alive. When Clive heard of this horrible deed, he marched against the native prince, and utterly defeated him in a battle called Plassey. He drove him from his throne and placed another prince, who was friendly to the British, upon it. He drove the French from their fortress there, and ever since then the power of Britain has grown and grown in India, until today our king, the King of Great Britain and Ireland, is also the Emperor of India. End of chapter 93. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org on September 9th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 94. George II, the story of how Canada was won. While these things were happening in India, the French and British were fighting in America also. The French colonies there were called Canada and Louisiana. Canada lay north of the British colonies beyond the St. Lawrence River. Louisiana lay west of the British colonies beyond the Mississippi River. If you look on the map, you will see that in this way the British colonies were quite shut in by the sea and by the French on all sides. This did not please the British. They wanted to be able to enlarge their colonies and to stretch out to the west, to the great forests and unknown land beyond Louisiana. The French, on the other hand, hoped to drive the British away from America altogether, and they built forts along the rivers and lakes to keep them as far as possible from the west. There were many quarrels, which grew more and more bitter, till at last war broke out. At first the British were not successful, but just as Walpole had been a great peace minister, so William Pitt, who was now in power, was a great war minister. He was quick to see what needed to be done, and just as quick in choosing the best men to do it. He did not ask whether a man was rich or powerful, or whether he had great relations. He asked, "Is this the best man I can find to do this piece of work?" So it came about that at this time the British all over the world were successful. Among the men whom Pitt sent to fight in America was a young man called James Wolfe. Wolfe was sent from England with 8,000 soldiers, and was told that he must take Quebec, the capital of Canada. He reached Canada and sailed up the St. Lawrence, greatly to the surprise of the French, for it was a very difficult passage, full of rocks and banks of sand. Yet Wolfe took his great warships, where the French would have feared to venture with their little trading vessels. He anchored opposite Quebec, and landed his soldiers on the island of Orleans. Quebec was a very strong town. It was built upon rocks high above the river, and was defended by the great French general Montcalm. For a long time Wolfe tried in vain to take the town. Montcalm was too clever and watchful. Day by day passed, and Wolfe grew ill with care and weariness. Many of his soldiers were killed, and the fresh troops which he expected did not arrive. At last he decided upon a bold and daring plan. There was one place which the French did not guard very strongly, because they thought it was quite impossible for the British to attack them there. This was a steep cliff, but Wolfe noticed there was a narrow pathway up this cliff, and he decided to take his soldiers by that path. He felt so doubtful of success, however, that he wrote a sad letter home before he made the attempt. "I have done little for my country," he said. "I have little hope of doing anything, but I have done my best." One dark night the British soldiers were rowed over the river. No one spoke. Everyone moved as quietly as possible. The oars even were muffled, so that the sound of rowing might not be heard by the French. Only Wolfe, as his boat went silently down the river, repeated a poem to his officers in a low voice. The poem was called An Elegy in a Country Churchyard, and it had been written a few years before by an English poet called Gray. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd wins slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. That is how the poem begins. It is a long poem, and very beautiful. And when Wolfe had finished repeating it, he turned to his officers and said, "Now, gentlemen, I would rather be the author of that poem than take Quebec." The boat reached the Quebec side of the river, and Wolfe was among the first to spring ashore. Silently, quickly, with beating hearts and held breath, the men followed. Then, as silently and quickly, the boats put off again, for there had been room in them only for half the soldiers, and they returned to bring the rest. The climb up the narrow pathway began. It was so narrow in places that only one could go at a time, but every man was full of courage and hope. They struggled up as best they could, clinging onto bushes, rocks, roots of trees, anything that would give them the least grip for hand or rest for foot. A regiment of Highlanders were among the first to lead the way, for they were used to scrambling and climbing among the rocks of their homeland. Nearer and nearer to the top they came, unseen and unheard by the French sentinels above. But at last the rustling among the bushes and leaves down the slope caught their ear. "What was that?" they asked, and fired at random down into the darkness. But it was too late. The first soldiers had reached the height. Others followed after them, and terrified at the sudden appearance of men where they had thought no men could be, the French sentinels ran away. As soon as the British reached the top, they fell into fighting order, and when day broke, the sun shone on their red coats as they stood drawn up in line upon the Heights of Abraham, as the place was called. At first, the French leader Montcalm could hardly believe that he saw aright. Then he said quietly, "I see them where they ought not to be. We must fight them, and I am going to crush them." A fierce battle followed. Wolfe was struck in the wrist, but he tied his handkerchief round it and went on fighting and giving orders as if nothing had happened. A second time he was hit. Still he went on. A third shot struck him in the breast. Then he sank to the ground with a groan. Wolfe was quickly carried out of the fight, but nothing could be done for him. He was dying. His officers stood sadly round him, when suddenly one of them cried, "See! They run! They run!" "Who run?" asked Wolfe, opening his eyes and trying to raise himself. "The enemy, sir," replied the officer. "They are running everywhere." "Thank God," said Wolfe. "I die happy." Then he fell back and never spoke again. The brave French leader Montcalm was also killed in this battle. "So much the better," he said when he was told that he was dying. "I shall not live to see Quebec surrender." Quebec did surrender, and Canada was won, and ever since then it has belonged to Britain, and today it is one of the greatest of her colonies. A few days after Wolfe's sad letter reached home, another, both sad and joyful, followed. It told of the taking of Quebec. It told too of the death of the brave young leader. Not once or twice in our fair island story the path of duty was the way to glory. He that ever following her commands, on with toil of heart and knees and hands, through the long gorge to the far light has won, his path upward and prevailed, shall find the toppling crags of duty scaled, are close upon the shining table lands, to which our God himself is moon and sun. Such was he, his work is done. But while the races of mankind endure, let his great example stand, colossal scene of every land, and keep the soldier firm, the statesman pure, till in all lands and through all human story the path of duty be the way to glory. End of chapter 94.
Chapter 95. George the Third. The Story of How America Was Lost. George II died in October 1759 A.D., and was succeeded by his grandson, George III, whose father, the Prince of Wales, had died some years before. George III had been born in England, and seemed more of an Englishman than either George I or George II. For that reason, and because he was young and handsome, the people were glad when he came to the throne. But he proved himself to be an unwise king, and it was during his reign that Britain suffered a great loss, the loss of all the American colonies except Canada. The wars which Britain had been fighting all over the world had cost a great deal of money. When Pitt saw a thing needed to be done, he did not stop to ask how much it would cost. He did it, and afterwards the country had to find ways and means of paying. War always costs a great deal, and the country had been fighting so much that it was now deeply in debt. The king's ministers, therefore, had to find some new way of raising money. It seemed to them that, as the war in America had been for the benefit of the colonists ought to pay some of the cost. This being so, King George decided to tax the Americans. You know what a tax means. If a certain thing costs 1 shilling a pound, and the government said, "We will put a tax of 2d. a pound on this thing," then it would cost 1 shilling and 2d., and the extra 2d. Would go to the government to help to pay the expenses of the country. For it requires money to keep up a country just as much as to keep up a house. You also know that the king could not make the people pay taxes without the consent of Parliament. That was a right for which the people and Parliament had fought over and over again, and which they had won at last. And if Parliament consented to a tax, it was really the people who consented, as the members of Parliament were chosen by the people. Now, the people of America sent no members to the British Parliament. When King George tried to make them pay taxes, they at once said, "No, that is not just. It is against the laws of Britain. If we are to pay taxes, we must be allowed to send members to Parliament, as England and Scotland do. If we are to pay taxes, we must have a share in making the laws and saying how the money is to be spent." This was quite reasonable, but King George was not reasonable. He said no. The Americans were very angry at this, and they made up their minds to do without the things which the king wanted to tax. This was very hard for them, especially as one of the things taxed was tea. You can imagine how difficult it would be to do without tea. While these things were happening, the great Pitt had been ill. When he was well again, and heard what George III and his foolish ministers had been doing, he was very angry. He said the Americans were quite right, and he talked so fiercely that all the taxes were taken off again, except the one on tea. George insisted on keeping that one. He was very angry with both Pitt and the Americans. He called them rebels, and Pitt the trumpet of rebellion. But the Americans would not yield even to one tax. There were meetings all over the States, and the young men banded together under the name of the Sons of Liberty. They swore to do anything rather than use taxed tea. At last ships arrived in Boston Harbor laden with tea. The Americans knew that if once the tea got ashore, it would be very difficult to keep the people from buying it. They determined that it should not be landed. While some of the wise people were talking and advising each other as to what should be done, about 20 young men dressed themselves as Red Indians. They painted their faces brown, stuck feathers in their hair, and put on clothes such as Red Indians wore. Red Indians are the natives of America, and although they have nearly died out now, in those days it was quite common to see them even in the towns. With wild war whoops, these make-believe Red Indians ran to the harbor. They sprang on board the tea ships, They seized the chests, opened them with their hatchets, and poured the tea into the water. Chest after chest was burst open, and the tea poured over the ship's side, till 342 chests had been emptied, and the harbour was black with tea-leaves. Many an honest merchant looked sadly on, many a thrifty housewife sighed to see the waste, but no one stopped the work. It was the greatest tea-making that had ever been seen, and for long after it was called the Boston Tea Party. When King George heard about this tea party, he was very angry. To punish the people of Boston, he forbade any ships to go there at all, so that the trade of the town was ruined, and the people became quite poor. He sent soldiers to frighten them into obedience, and did many other things in order to punish the rebels. But the Americans would not bear such treatment, and they talked of war. King George seemed to be quite pleased at the idea of fighting the Americans. "We will soon bring them to their senses," he said. "They will only behave like lions as long as we behave like lambs. I will show them that I mean to be firm, and they will soon be meek enough." But the Americans were not meek at all. They made ready to fight. Soon 20,000 colonists were in arms, and George Washington, a young soldier, who had already shown his bravery and skill in fighting against the French, was their leader. The war began in the year 1775 A.D., and it was quite as dreadful as a civil war. The colonists looked upon Britain as their mother country. They talked of it as home. And now, for want of a little kindly feeling and understanding between them, mother and children were fighting bitterly. As time went on, the Americans became more and more determined not to give in. On the 4th of July, 1776 A.D., they very solemnly made their Declaration of Independence. "We, the representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, solemnly publish and declare that these United States are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." This means that the Americans felt that they were doing right and not wrong in fighting against the mother country. They felt that they ought to be free, and they declared that they were free and independent. Independent means standing alone. While the war was being carried on in the States, at home Pitt, the great war minister, who was now called Lord Chatham, was struggling for peace. He had worked very hard to make Britain great and to make the colonies great. Now he saw that all his work was to be ruined by civil war, and he tried to stop it. "You cannot conquer America," he said. "They are of our own blood. If I were an American, as I am an Englishman, I would never lay down my arms. Never, never, never." But the king and his friends would not listen to Pitt, and the war went on. Then a worse thing happened. France joined America against Britain. Britain, by driving the French out of America, had given the Americans peace. Now Britain's old enemy had joined with her own people against her. That was the worst blow of all. It frightened the Parliament, and some members wanted to acknowledge the freedom of America. Old and ill although he was, when Pitt heard of it, he rose from his bed, and once more went to speak in the House. His voice was weak and feeble as he spoke. "I am glad," he said, "that I am still alive and able to lift up my voice against breaking up the empire." Pitt had wanted to give the Americans what they asked for, but now he wanted to fight with France. France, he felt, had no right in the quarrel. He would not yield to French threats what had been refused to America alone. But Pitt was old and feeble. The excitement of speaking was too much for the great statesman. He fell senseless to the ground, and was carried home to die. Then not only France, but Spain joined with America, and at last the bitter end came. Britain was obliged to give way, and in 1782 A.D., after a war which had lasted nearly 8 years, the United States were acknowledged to be a free and independent country, and Britain lost all her possessions in North America, except Canada. End of chapter 95. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on September 9th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 96. George III, a story of the spinning wheel. While Britain was fighting and losing a great colony, another battle was being fought and won. This was a peaceful battle. The battle of industries and inventions. To invent really means to find out, and people were now finding out all kinds of things, which made living much more easy and comfortable. The two chief things which were found out about this time were, first, how to spin cotton, wool, and linen by machinery instead of by hand, and second, how to use steam to make this machinery work, and how to make it draw trains along lines and carry ships over the sea. Before spinning frames were invented, women used to spin with wheels in their own homes, but that was such slow work that the weavers could not get enough yarn to keep their looms going, and because of that they could not make as much cloth as they might otherwise have done. They grumbled so much about this that clever people began to wonder if it would be possible to spin in some quicker way. Among these clever people was a man called Richard Arkwright. Richard Arkwright's father and mother were very poor, and they had a great many children, 13 in all, and of those 13, Richard was the youngest. As Richard's father and mother were so poor, and had so many children, they had no money to spend in sending them to school, and in those days there were no free schools. So Richard hardly knew how to read or write. What he did know he taught himself, with the help of an uncle who was very kind to him. When Richard grew up, he became a barber. He rented a little cellar, and there he stuck up his red and white pole, which was the sign of a barber's shop. Then he waited for people to come to have their hair cut and to be shaved. But for some reason or other, very few people came. Perhaps it was because Richard's shop was little and dark and downstairs. Perhaps it was because he was always thinking of other things, and so did not make a very good barber. Whatever the reason was, few people came, and Richard became poorer and poorer. At last he had a great idea. If people would not come to be shaved for 2 pence, which was the usual price, why then he would shave them for 1 penny, and in this way cut out all the other barbers. So he wrote a big sign and pasted it over his doorway. "Come to the subterraneous barber, he shaves for a penny." Subterraneous means underground. It was not long before some people saw this sign. "Hello," they said. "What is this? Shave for a penny? Well, there is no harm in trying." So they tried, and Richard's shop became the fashion. It was crowded, while those of other barbers were empty. The other barbers were very angry, but what was to be done? People were not likely to pay 2 pence when they could be shaved for 1 penny. But at last the barbers all agreed that they too should put up signs saying that they shaved for 1 penny. Richard, however, did not want to lose all the trade which he had gained. He wrote out a new sign: "Come to the subterraneous barber, he shaves for a halfpenny." So he was still the cheapest barber in the town. But shaving for a halfpenny did not pay very well. At this time, nearly everyone wore wigs. Even people who had hair enough of their own cut it short and wore wigs of long hair tied behind with ribbon. Arkwright found out how to dye hair different colours, so he left off shaving and travelled about the country buying hair from people who were willing to sell it. Then he dyed it to the fashionable colour and made it into wigs for fine gentlemen. This paid very much better than shaving people for a halfpenny, and soon Arkwright's hair was known to be the best in the country. He got on so well that he gave up his little shop in the cellar and took a better one. But Richard was not really interested in making wigs. What he really liked was machinery, and he spent all his spare time making models of a spinning frame. He got a man called Kay, who was a watchmaker, to help him, and Richard soon became so interested in his machinery that he neglected his business and became quite poor again. Richard's wife, finding that they were growing poorer and poorer, thought that this was all the fault of the models, so one day she smashed them, hoping her husband would go back to his wig making. Richard was very grieved when he found his beautiful models broken, but far from giving up, he became even more determined to go on making models. He was so poor by this time, and his clothes were in such rags, that he could not go out in the streets. Richard got leave to set up his machine in a schoolhouse. The house was in a quiet place surrounded by a garden, so that Arkwright and Kay could work in peace. This was very necessary, for Richard Arkwright's wife was not the only person who wished to smash models or even machinery itself. The work people were very ignorant, and they hated these new inventions, which they thought were going to take away their work. They hated them so much that when the new inventions came into use, the work people often broke into the factories and wrecked the machines. But even in his quiet garden, Richard was not quite safe, for two old women who lived not far off could hear the whirring and humming of the machinery. They were very frightened at these new strange noises, which they thought must be made by evil spirits. They told people that the sound was as if the wicked one was tuning his bagpipes, while Arkwright and Kay danced a jig. The people would have broken into the house to see what was really there, but they were too much afraid of the evil spirits. At last Arkwright conquered all his difficulties. His spinning frame was a success, and although his troubles did not end for a long time, he at length made a great fortune, and died Sir Richard Arkwright. He not only made a great fortune for himself, but he helped to make Britain wealthy. After Arkwright's invention came into use, the looms could make so much cloth that the merchants had enough not only to supply Britain, but to sell to other countries. Britain began to be called the workshop of the world, and a few years later a great Frenchman called us a nation of shopkeepers, a name of which we have no reason to be ashamed. Other men besides Arkwright invented spinning frames, but I have told you about Arkwright because his was the first really successful frame, and the machines which are used today are almost the same as those he invented. Arkwright built mills and taught his workpeople how to use the machines, and from his time the great factories began to grow up, which now give work to so many people, and which have made so many towns rich and famous. Arkwright's frames were first worked by water, so that a factory could only be built near a stream. But later, when Watt and Stephenson discovered the power of steam, they were worked by steam. When Watt and Stephenson made their engines and built railways, when British steamship carrying British goods sailed proudly over the seas, Britain was more than ever mistress of the waves, and she was also the workshop and market of the world. End of chapter 96.
Chapter 97. George III. England expects that every man will do his duty. This island loves thee well, thou famous man, the greatest sailor since our world began. In 1789 A.D., a revolution broke out in France. The French people rose against their king and queen, and killed them, and many of the nobles as well. Then they declared the country to be a commonwealth, or republic, as the English had done in the time of Cromwell. At this time, William Pitt the younger, son of the great William Pitt, Lord Chatham, was Prime Minister. He, unlike his father, was a peace minister. Britain, with her new factories and new trade, was growing wealthy, and Pitt tried hard to keep the country at peace. But he tried in vain, for France declared war. Once more, for nearly 20 years, Britain was fighting by land and by sea. The French were led by Napoleon Bonaparte. He was one of the most wonderful men who have ever lived. Beginning life as a poor, unknown soldier, he soon rose to be leader of the French army. He rose and rose until the people made him Emperor of France. His one desire was to be great and powerful, and he did not care how others suffered, or how many people were killed, so long as he had what he wanted. He made war all over Europe. He conquered kings and gave away their thrones and crowns to his own friends and relatives, and only the British were strong enough to stand against him. Napoleon made up his mind to conquer Britain. He raised an army which he called the Army of England, and he made a medal in honor of the conquest of Britain which never took place, and engraved upon the medal, "Struck at London," although he never reached there. It was like Caligula and his army gathering shells on the shore, for Napoleon and his men came no nearer conquering Britain than those old Romans did. Many of the Irish hated the English and would have been glad to help the French. Napoleon knew this, and he decided that Ireland was the best place at which to begin the attack. He fitted out a great fleet, with the intention of landing in Ireland. But his ships were shattered by the winds, as the ships of the Armada had been, and nothing came of this invasion. A little later the French really did land in Ireland, but the king's army was ready for them, and they were forced to go away again. Up till this time Ireland had still a separate parliament, just as Scotland had before 1707 A.D. Ireland made laws for itself, and, in fact, except that it had the same king as Britain, there was no union between the countries. Pitt and other wise men felt that this was not right. They saw how much more difficult it would be for Napoleon to conquer Ireland if it was really united to England and Scotland. So they worked hard, till at last it was arranged that the Irish Parliament should join the British. In January 1801 A.D., the first Imperial Parliament was called, and since then English, Irish, and Scottish members have sat together in the same house, and have made the laws for the whole land. On the 1st of January, King George made a proclamation saying that his title should now be George III, by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith. For the first time since the days of Henry V, the King of Britain no longer called himself King of France too. For in spite of the fact that the kings of Britain had never really been kings of France, they had always claimed the crown of France as a right. The Great Seal was also changed, and the royal standard, instead of bearing the arms of England and the fleur-de-lis of France, now bore the arms of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Meanwhile, British ships under the great sailor Nelson were victorious by sea, and on land British soldiers hindered and spoiled Napoleon's plans. At last, as everyone was tired of the war, peace was signed. But peace did not last long. The following year war broke out again, and Napoleon threatened once more to invade Britain. But the British built watchtowers and beacons along the coast, so that warning could be sent from town to town if the dreaded tyrant should come. The young men drilled as volunteers to guard their homes. Everyone was ready for the ogre Napoleon, who never came. While these preparations were being made at home, Nelson swept the seas, searching for the French and Spanish navies, and at last they met in Trafalgar Bay, off the coast of Spain. A few days before they met, Nelson wrote to a friend, Here I am watching for the French and the Spaniards like a cat after the mice. If they come out, I know I shall catch them, but I am also almost sure that I shall be killed in doing it." On the 21st of October, 1805 A.D., the battle began. Every captain in the fleet had received his orders and knew exactly what to do, but Nelson felt there was still something wanting, and from the topgallant mast of his own ship, the Victory, a message was signalled through all the fleet. "England expects that every man will do his duty." The message was greeted with cheer upon cheer from every ship along the line, and every sailor felt his courage rise. The battle soon became fierce. Shot and shell flew thick and fast. Once, as Nelson and Hardy, the captain of the Victory, stood on deck together, a shot fell between them, tearing off one of Captain Hardy's shoe buckles. Each looked at the other, fearing he was wounded. Then, seeing neither of them were hurt, Nelson smiled and said calmly, "This is too warm work, Hardy, to last long." Everything went well with the British. Already it seemed as if the victory was sure, when a chance shot struck Nelson, and he fell forward on the deck. "They have done for me at last, Hardy," he said, as some sailors, seeing their dear admiral fall, ran forward to carry him to a safe place. As Nelson was being carried past those who were fighting, he covered his face and the stars and medals on his coat, in case they should see that he was wounded and feel discouraged, for his sailors loved him dearly. The great admiral was dying fast, but before he died Hardy was able to bring him the news that victory was theirs, and that 14 or 15 of the enemy's ships had surrendered. "I hope," said Nelson, "that none of our ships have struck their colors." "No, my lord, there is no fear of that." That's well," he answered. "Kiss me, Hardy," he said, a little later. Hardy knelt and kissed him. "I am satisfied now," he said. "Thank God I have done my duty." These were his last words. With the Battle of Trafalgar, which was fought on the 21st of October, 1805 A.D., Napoleon's power by sea was utterly shattered, and Britain was saved from all fear of invasion. The little ribbon of water between France and England was enough to keep her safe from the threats of the master of half Europe. "'Twas in Trafalgar's Bay we saw the Frenchmen lay, each heart was bounding then. We scorned the foreign yoke, our ships were British oak, and hearts of oak our men. Our Nelson marked them on the wave, 3 cheers our gallant seamen gave, nor thought of home or beauty. Along the line the signal ran, England expects that every man this day will do his duty. And now the cannons roar along the affrighted shore, our Nelson led the way. His ship the Victory named, long be that victory famed, for victory crowned the day. But dearly was that conquest bought, too well the gallant hero fought for England, home, and beauty. He cried as midst the fire he ran, England expects that every man this day will do his duty. At last the fatal wound, which spread dismay around, the hero's breast received. Heaven fights on our side, the day's our own, he cried. Now long enough I've lived. In honor's cause my life was passed, in honor's cause I fall at last, for England, home, and beauty. Thus ending life as he began, England confessed that every man that day had done his duty. End of chapter 97. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on September 10th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 98. George III, The Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon hated Britain so much that besides fighting against her with soldiers, he tried to fight in another way. He tried to ruin British trade. Napoleon forbade other countries to trade with Britain, but it was of little use, and so ill did he succeed that his very own soldiers were dressed in British-made cloth and wore British-made boots. As Portugal still traded with Britain, Napoleon made that an excuse for invading Portugal. At the same time, he seized the King of Spain and his son and forced them to sign a paper saying that they gave up the throne of Spain. Napoleon then made his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, king. But although the king and prince had been forced to sign away the throne, the people of Spain had something to say about it. They refused to have Joseph Bonaparte as their king. They rose to a man and rebelled against him, and they asked the British to help them. So 2 years after Trafalgar, the Peninsular War began. It is called the Peninsular War because it was fought in and for the peninsula, formed by Spain and Portugal. At first the war was not very successful, but when Arthur Wellesley, afterwards Lord Wellington, took command, things went better. Gradually, the French were driven back to France, and the war ended with the Battle of Toulouse on 14th of April, 1814 AD. While this war was going on, Napoleon had also been fighting with Russia. There he was utterly crushed. Everywhere the peoples he had conquered revolted against him, and a few days before the Battle of Toulouse he had been made to give up the throne of France and was banished to the island of Elba. Of the many kingdoms which Napoleon had conquered, this little island in the Mediterranean Sea was all that he was allowed to keep. But he soon grew tired of playing at being emperor there. The following year, while the kings and princes of Europe were gathered at Vienna, trying to bring order and peace to the lands which Napoleon had upset with his wars and conquests, he left Elba and made straight for Paris. Cruel and selfish though he was, his soldiers loved him, for he had so often led them to victory. When he suddenly appeared among them, they flocked to him, and the people cheered and welcomed him. Once more, Napoleon was Emperor of the French, but this time his rule lasted only 100 days. The kings and princes at Vienna had not been able to agree about settling the affairs of Europe, but when they heard that Napoleon was once more in Paris, fear of him made them all unite. They gathered their armies for a great struggle against the terrible emperor. Wellington had command of 80,000 men, but only about half of these were British. The rest were Dutch, Belgian and German. Blücher, the great German general, had another army of 150,000 men, and there was yet a third army of Russians and Austrians, and all these armies marched towards France. But Napoleon did not wait for them to come. He marched out to meet them, and a great battle took place on 18th of June 1815 AD at Waterloo, not far from Brussels. "Ah," said Napoleon, "at last I shall measure swords with this Valentin." For although the French and British troops had often met, Napoleon had always been fighting elsewhere, and had never met Wellington in battle. The fight was fierce and long, and as Wellington watched and directed, he anxiously looked for Blücher and his Prussians, who had promised to join and help him. "Knight or Blücher," said Wellington, "knight or Blücher," for he knew that the coming of either would put an end to this dreadful fight. At last, about 7 in the evening, Blücher and his Prussians came. Then Napoleon made one more desperate struggle for victory. The soldiers of his old guard, who had been kept in reserve, were ordered forward, but they broke and fled before the British charge. Napoleon, as he watched, became deadly pale. "All is lost," he said, turning to his officers who surrounded him. "We must save ourselves," and he rode from the field. Not till after the battle did Blücher and Wellington meet. In German fashion, the old Prussian general threw his arms around Wellington and kissed him. It was a great victory. and by it Europe was saved from tyranny. Yet Wellington was sad as he looked round on the dead and the dying. The British troops were worn out with the long day's fighting, but the Prussians were still fresh, and Blucher started off to chase the flying Frenchmen, who ran as fast as they were able. They hid in the woods and ditches, threw away their arms, knapsacks, and everything they could, so they might run the faster and escape from the pursuing Prussians. They fled till they passed the borders of France, where they scattered to their homes, a broken, beaten army, never to be gathered together again. Napoleon gave himself up to the British. He was taken to England on board a British man-of-war called the Bellerophon, but he was not allowed to land. He was kept on board the Bellerophon until the kings of Europe decided to send him to St. Helena, a lonely island in the Atlantic Ocean. There he could do no harm, and there he stayed until he died 6 years later. End of chapter 98.
Chapter 99. George the Fourth, the First Gentleman in Europe. George III died in January 1820 A.D. and was succeeded by his son, George IV. George IV had already been reigning as regent for 10 years, for during that time his father had been mad, and so unable to rule, and towards the end of his life he had become blind and deaf as well. George III was called Farmer George, because he liked a peaceful country life, and would have been a very good farmer, although he was not a very wise king. He had reigned 60 years, including the last 10, during which he really did not rule. George IV was called the First Gentleman in Europe, because he was handsome and had fine manners, very different from those of his homely father. He tried to make friends with all his people through his fine manners. Soon after he became king, he went to Ireland, where the people received him with great joy. He made speeches to them, and laughed and cried with them. He wore the Order of St. Patrick on his breast, and great bunches of shamrock in his cap. He told them that he loved his Irish people, and that he was Irish at heart, and altogether acted his part very well. But it was merely acting, for George IV only cared for himself, and was not in the least a good king. The warm-hearted Irish people, however, believed in him, and, when he sailed away again, some of them were so eager to catch a last glimpse of their king that they fell into the sea and were nearly drowned. George next went to Hanover, for he was King of Hanover as well as King of Britain. There he talked German, and wore a Hanoverian order, sang German national songs, and told the people with tears in his eyes that he was truly German at heart, and perhaps the German people believed him too. Next he went to Scotland. Since the time of Charles I, no king had visited Scotland, and the people crowded to welcome him. The road from Leith to Edinburgh was lined with gentlemen to do him honour, and as King George drove along through the lines of cheering people, it was seen that he was dressed in Stuart tartan, and that he wore the Order of the Thistle. George had wept and laughed with his Irish subjects, yet when a chance came for him to prove that he loved them as he had said he did not willingly take it. In the fierce old days, the Roman Catholics had killed and tortured the Protestants whenever they had the power, and, in dread of them, an act had been passed forbidding Roman Catholics to hold any public office. Those days were long past. No one was now killed or tortured because of his religion, yet the laws against the Roman Catholics still remained. No Catholic might be an officer in the army or navy, no Catholic might sit in Parliament, or serve his country in any way. Yet nearly all the Irish people were Roman Catholics, and generous men for many years had felt these laws to be unjust. The younger Pitt had tried in vain to make George III do away with them. Now wise men tried to make George IV repeal them, but the king, who said he was Irish at heart, refused. "My father," he said, "would have laid his head on the block rather than yield, and I am equally ready to lay my head there for the same cause." The great Duke of Wellington was Prime Minister at this time, and as he had conquered Napoleon in war, so now he conquered George IV in peace. He stood firm, and at last the king was forced to give way. A bill called the Catholic Emancipation Act, which means Freeing Act, was passed by Parliament. Since then Roman Catholics have been allowed to sit in Parliament, to be officers, or to hold any other post which is open to Protestants, although no king may rule in Britain unless he is a Protestant. George IV died in June 1830 A.D., having reigned 10 years. He was an utterly selfish man and a bad king. Yet the British nation had grown so strong that even a bad king could not do much harm, while there were great men around him to work for their country. End of chapter 99. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on September 10th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
Chapter 100. William IV, the story of two peaceful victories. George IV had only one child, a daughter, and she died some time before her father, so he was succeeded by his brother William, who was 65 years old when he came to the throne. William was called the Sailor King, because he had served in the navy. He was bluff and rough and good-natured, not at all like a king. He used to be fond of strolling about London with a walking stick or an umbrella, just like an ordinary man. But British people have always loved a sailor, so they were glad when William became king, and hoped that he would prove a better one than George IV. That some of his people had not much reverence for him is shown by one man who wrote of him, "He seems a kind-hearted, well-meaning, not stupid, bustling old fellow, and if he doesn't go mad, may make a very decent king." Later, the same man called him one of the silliest old gentlemen in his dominions. If he had been left to himself, the well-meaning old fellow would have been quite pleased to jog along without troubling about his kingdom or his duties. But that was not to be. The days of the clatter and jangle of steel armour were over. The roar and crackle of musket and cannon was silent for the time, but in the peace and silence men were thinking and planning and working for the good of the nation. For hundreds of years the people of Britain had had the right of choosing men to send to Parliament to tell their troubles and their wrongs, and to help to make just laws for the ruling of the country. The whole nation, of course, cannot go to Westminster, for no building would be large enough to contain them all, and the talking would never be finished, and no laws would ever be made. So, each county and each big town chooses a man who goes to Parliament to speak and vote in the name of those who send him. That is what is intended. But at this time the reality was something quite different. During the hundreds of years which had passed since it had been first arranged which town should send members to Parliament, there had been many changes. Places which had once been large towns had, for some reason or another, become deserted. Where there had been houses, churches, shops, and crowded, busy streets, there was now perhaps only one lonely house, or perhaps only a deserted hillside. Yet that lonely house or deserted hillside continued to send a member to Parliament. On the other hand, since factories had been built, great towns had sprung up, where 100 years before there had been perhaps only a single cottage. But these great towns, with all their hard-working people, had no right to send a member to Parliament, and could have no voice in making the laws. This seems very absurd nowadays. We think it would be quite easy for any sensible man to see that this state of affairs was wrong. But 100 years ago, many sensible people did not see it. They were pleased with things as they were, and very angry with those who tried to alter them. But some people were quite determined they should be altered, and two men, called Lord Grey and Lord John Russell, brought into Parliament what is called the Reform Bill. This bill took the right of sending any one to Parliament away from the bare and lonely hillsides, and gave the right to the new and busy towns, so that the people should really be represented. That is, should have someone in Parliament to act and speak for them. There was a long and fierce struggle before this bill became law. You know that there are two Houses of Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. A bill to become law must be read in both houses, and must be voted for by the greater number of the members in each. That is, more than half the members must vote for it. For instance, if there were only 100 members, at least 51 must vote for a bill before it is said to have passed. Having passed both houses, it must receive the consent of the king before it can become law. After a great deal of difficulty, the Commons were made to consent to the Reform Bill, but the Lords did not want it. Neither did the king, and again they refused consent. The country, however, had become so determined about it that there were riots everywhere when it became known that the Lords would not pass the bill. The people, who had been quite ready to love their king, began to hate him, and instead of cheering when he appeared, they hissed and groaned. So bitter did the feeling become that the friends of the bill feared that there would be another revolution, and at last they forced the king to give his consent. The Lords followed, and the bill became law. One more step toward liberty had been taken. Another great thing which happened during the reign of William IV was the freeing of slaves. For many years, people had been in the habit of stealing black people from their homes in Africa and selling them as slaves in the colonies. People had grown so used to it that they did not see how wicked and cruel this was. These poor black people were taken to market and sold like cattle. They were branded like cattle and beaten like cattle. They had to work very hard, were paid no wages, and were often very cruelly treated. All masters, of course, were not cruel. Some of them were even kind to their poor slaves, but they still had very unhappy lives. They had no rights whatever. Their children might be taken from them and sold. Sometimes even husbands and wives were sold to different masters, and never saw each other again. A master might treat his slaves as badly as he chose, and no one could punish him. In the old rough, wild days, no one cared about the sufferings of these poor black people. They were only niggers, and made for work and suffering, and nothing was thought about it. But as time went on, people became less rough and more kind-hearted, and good men began to try to make people see the wickedness of slavery. For some years, a man called Wilberforce had been doing his best, and now he was joined by others, among whom was Macaulay, the father of the great writer. Mr. Macaulay had himself been a manager of a sugar plantation in the West Indies, where slaves worked, but he gave up his post because he could not bear to see the misery and unhappiness of the slaves, and came home to try to do something for them. It was not a very easy thing to do, because all the work on the sugar and coffee plantations in the West Indies was done by slaves. The planters said they would be ruined if the slaves were made free, as the black people would not work unless they were forced to do so. Besides, they had paid a great deal of money for their slaves, and it seemed unfair that they should be made to lose it all. But, at last, all difficulties were smoothed away. The British Parliament said that they would give 20 millions of money to the planters to make up for what they would lose in freeing their slaves. And in the year 1834 AD, most of them were set free. Many other things were done during the reign of William IV, which you will find more interesting when you grow older. He died on 20th of June 1837 AD, having reigned 7 years. End of chapter 100.